Hello everybody, welcome back. We're here, we're back in the studio. We actually just finished up the Orlando Guitar Show. NAMM just concluded and a lot of things are happening in the music gear space. And that's our dear friend Kaylee upstairs. So we're just gonna keep it rolling because this is a operating business right now. A lot of stuff is changing in the music gear and guitar space. Prices are definitely changing. Things are happening in kind of all aspects of the market. I just kind of wanted to share some of my perspective today. I don't know everything. I have a kind of a pretty particular segment of the market that I focus on. If you see our inventory at philosophygear.com, shameless plug, that's the kind of stuff that I'm dealing in every single day. So I have a pretty good understanding of what's kind of going on in that subset of the market. If you're talking about super low end stuff or super high end stuff, I might not be the #1 resource. But if you're looking for anything from like a American Standard or Japanese reissue Fender to a Gibson Les Paul Standard or like a custom shop Les Paul Jr., that's our world. I'm pretty in touch with what's going on with the $1,000 to $3,000 guitar range, I'll say. So I've been seeing two things go around a lot lately in other videos. One that like, oh, the whole guitar market is getting flooded and all the prices are coming way down. And then on the other end, I've seen, oh, all the nice stuff is getting unattainable and those prices are getting crazy and they're just gonna keep getting crazier. There's definitely truth to both those, but I also think the truth probably lies somewhere in between. I wanted to not only talk about what's happening price-wise and kind of my predictions of where things are gonna go, but also talk about what's happening on the manufacturing end and how I think that is gonna start influencing used gear prices going forward. So right now in actually February 2025, as of filming this, a lot of things are happening. A lot of stuff has changed over the last few years. I'll say I'm not huge on talking about prices in videos just because stuff does change so much and things are also so subjective. And the same guitar can sell for more at a nice shop than maybe like an individual would ask for it on like Facebook Marketplace. So it's always tough to pin down a specific price. I more so just want to talk about like trends that I'm seeing rather than like dollar price points. It's just kind of where I see things shifting overall. I think a good place to start is actually gonna start on some recent events, and that is the country of origin changing for certain guitars. The main company that I wanna talk about here with this is Fender. A lot of stuff has been changing with Fender guitars. The timing of this is kind of beautiful because we just did a video on the Fender Bullet series that they did back in the early 80s, and it was how they were trying to build a guitar to a price point for the beginner to intermediate player in a similar price range to where we would see like a Mexico Player series these days. But these were American-made guitars just with some spec compromises to get them down to a certain price point. When I was growing up, getting into guitars, getting into Fender guitars specifically, there was always the Fender Standard series, and this was their Mexican stuff. For the longest time, I remember these being $4.99, whether you wanted a Tele, a Strat, a precision bass, or a jazz bass. You could go to your big box guitar store or big box guitar store website, and you could get a brand new Mexican-made Standard Telecaster or any of those other models for $4.99. In 2018, they rolled out the Player series, which brought the entry point up to $700 to $800, depending which one you wanted. But what happened there is they left a bit of a gap. The Squier guitars mainly went up to $400, maybe a little bit more, maybe $500, and then Fender wasn't starting until $700 or $800. So really recent to making this video, they just relaunched their Standard line, but this time it's different. These are guitars made in Indonesia, made in the same factory that these Squier guitars are being made in. So this is obviously stirred up a bunch of controversy with it saying Fender on the headstock, not Squier. Why is that made in Indonesia instead of in Mexico? The obvious answer is simple, is that it's just more cost effective to build a guitar in Indonesia. It's easier to build to a price point there than it is obviously in America as well as even Mexico. So Fender is basically kind of making their entry point to it saying Fender on the headstock actually lower. I'm sure if you factor in inflation, this $599 entry price point is probably like the lowest that they've ever had for to say Fender. They did offer the Modern Player series a while back that was made in China, but those guitars I believe were all $499. Again, factoring inflation, I think that probably ended up being a little bit more now. So what's happening here is now they're kind of positioning their Mexico stuff to be a little bit higher end. Now they're trying to make that kind of the intermediate level Fender. You know, your first gigging guitar, that's when you get really serious. Maybe you get into a Player series or their Ventura series, which is like their reissue style guitars. And what that does is it makes their Japanese and American guitars on like a whole other echelon, and those are being put into this like, not boutique, but like kind of way higher end line, which is cool, but it's kind of not. Fender's kind of trying to push you to say, hey, the Player 2 series, that's our like standard guitar now. To me, the flagship Fender should be whatever that American flagship guitar is right now. It should be, right now it's the American Professional 2 series. That should be the flagship Fender. I would say we were noticing this shift as much as 5 years ago, actually, on our first trip over to Japan. We went over there in March 2020, which was very convenient timing, to play some shows, no intention of like doing any business or guitar stuff. And we started going to guitar shops and noticing that over in Japan, they were kind of marketing some of their Mexico stuff as like, hey, this is a North American import. This is one of our flagship guitars. They weren't promoting like the cheapest Fender Mexico guitars, but they were promoting, you know, these signature model guitars and these higher end guitars that rather than being made in the States, are being made over in Mexico. I mean, it's been quite a while that they've been starting to put some of their higher end guitars in production in Mexico and then charging the amount of money that you would expect to pay for an American or Japanese guitar. So this, I think, is something that Fender's kind of had in the works for a while. Quality control level has definitely been increasing, so it is somewhat warranted, but it is just kind of a weird thing to adapt to. In some ways, it's actually kind of cool because I think the Fender Mexico line is really in line with what Leo Fender was going for all those years ago, which was just a cheap, modular guitar that you can replace parts on that's reliable. The Mexico line lives up to that. They're simple, they usually stay in tune, they have decent components, and they do what they're supposed to do. And what that's kind of done is it's made these American guitars become something perceived as a little fancier. And that's cool, so maybe some could argue that Fender is actually moving in the direction that Leo would have wanted them to. So we got really in-depth on Fender there, but we're actually focusing on used guitars here. Why do we get that in depth? My point here is as the country of origin changes for different models and Fender places different guitars at different kind of tiers across their entire series, it definitely changes what's happening in the used market. We may eventually see it be $1,000 as an entry point to the Mexican guitars. And what that's gonna do is kind of drive up the price of used guitars that are made not only in Mexico, but obviously Japan and America as well. As these newer guitars become more and more expensive to manufacture, then in turn more and more expensive to the consumer, I do see the used prices kind of creeping up. So even though we're seeing a bit of a lull in some stuff right now, I think it's gonna turn around, which is not necessarily a good thing as a player. You know, we don't wanna see stuff get unattainable. We want quality guitars to still be available at an accessible price point. But I think as we see the country of origin kind of get pushed down, you know, as you're seeing a $600 Fender being made in Indonesia, it's kind of strengthening the price of a $1,000 guitar that's made in America or made in Japan, even if it's used. The used market will always be influenced by the new market and what you can buy new. As new stuff gets more expensive, a lot of times used guitars come with it. This is why you'll see like older Fender Mexico stuff go for as much as it did new, because compared to the other new options now, even buying a older Mexican guitar for more than its retail price is probably a better value than a lot of Fender's newer offerings. So one thing I don't love about seeing the factories kind of move down in order to manufacture newer guitars, and this is not just with Fender, this is with all kinds of different brands. Lower end guitars are almost becoming like consumer electronics. Like they're becoming disposable. They're not built to last. They're not built with the same quality woods that they were before. And that's not just the classic additive, oh, they don't make them like they used to, but literally to meet a price point, we're just cost cutting at every measure. If you look at, you know, 60s Strats are still alive and well. They have stood the test of time. You'll see Japanese made Strats from the 80s and 90s, and of course the American stuff from all those years as well. They're still around, and those guitars are going to be around longer than I'll be around, and that's pretty cool. Obviously to me, that's how an instrument should be manufactured, especially on the professional level. There's always going to be a demand for something that's at a lower price point. I don't expect everyone to be able to afford to just jump right into the, you know, the big stuff. If you're spending that kind of money, you should be investing in something that is going to be around for a very long time. I don't really like this shift of like just making stuff cheaper and cheaper and more disposable. What is going to happen? What's going on with these new standard series Fenders in 10, 20, 30 years? Are these 2025 standard Fenders still going to be around, or will they have not stood the test of time? Obviously, there's no way to know now. It's just kind of an interesting thought. I definitely don't think that we should be comparing instruments to consumer electronics, but when building to a price point, those comparisons become more and more common. I was having this discussion with a friend of mine who lives over in Japan, and his conclusion of all this was buy vintage, so take that for what you will. I know for me, something that's really important is looking at those guitars that are at this point 30 years old, that have stood the test of time, and going, okay, the stuff made in those factories with those specs, that level of production, if those are still alive and well and those have the kind of survivor bias going for them, stuff that's being manufactured similarly today is probably going to fare similarly. Obviously, we all know the classic American stuff made in the 50s and 60s was great from the brands like Gibson, Fender. Looking at 90s Ibanez guitars are definitely standing the test of time, and they're still making a lot of guitars like that, especially in like their J Custom line and their Prestige line. I think it's worth looking at stuff like that and drawing comparisons of what has stood the test of time before and what is still being manufactured in a similar way with a similar level of care. While we can, of course, never predict the future, that to me is the best way to predict how is this instrument gonna fare over time? Not just financially, but just as a usable instrument, as that's what this is, it's a tool. This is not a stock. Guitars will appreciate in value, or at least a lot of them will. I still don't like saying they're an investment. They're an investment in enjoyment, but they are not a stock. This is not the S&P 500. Saying this more from the perspective of, is this going to be something that you are going to be able to use and enjoy for years to come and potentially pass down and all that kind of stuff. So what does that mean right now? I think to understand where the guitar market is at now, we actually have to go back a few years to 2020 and what was kind of happening there. I've been doing a flash video gear since 2016, obviously started super small and it's just very slowly grown over the years. And by 2019, I had a pretty decent selection of guitars. By 2020, when it started to be harder to get new guitars in, the used guitars that I had started selling through really, really fast. I remember I was actually recording at the time with my friend David, shout out to David. He was going on Reverb looking for guitars and gear as we all do. And he started being like, man, every good deal has been bought on Reverb. All that's left is stuff that's from like retail shops. A lot of times retail shops, if they're carrying a used guitar, will still carry a little bit higher price for a used guitar. Let's say like an individual sell on Reverb has a guitar listed for 400 and they're 600 new. The retail shop a lot of time doesn't have to sell their guitar for 400 because they're a real accredited business. They have a return policy, customer service, all of that. They might be able to ask 500 for that same guitar and sell it just as fast as an individual can sell for 400. So as these kind of better deals on used guitars from individual sellers were bought up because new guitars were shrinking in supply since all of a sudden 2020, there's this huge demand for guitars. I started to see the prices that individual sellers were asking for start to raise a good bit. And then all of a sudden, guitars were 20% more expensive, not overnight, but over the course of a few months. I think there was some needed correction there. I think back then a lot of stuff was cheap, but as the new stuff was starting to become unavailable, it really showed like there's a lot of value in used guitars that kind of wasn't realized until that point. That goes on for like a year, and then we start seeing all of a sudden PRS SE guitars that previously were available new for 600 are being sold used for 650. I was never pricing our guitars at 650 if it was available new for 6. I just priced it at 500 or whatever the number was and let ours sell really quickly. And that's actually what allowed FlashFoot to scale a lot in those years from 2020 to 2022, which is kind of what gets us to today actually, is that I think people started metricing, oh, this guitar that was new was 600, all of a sudden was being listed used for 650, $700. Now those guitars are 500. That means they've lost 20% of their value. Well, I don't think that's totally accurate because the 650 price point was never really realistic to begin with. Most reputable dealers weren't buying into that hype. We were just selling stuff for the same price that it would make sense to. Obviously, as new prices increased, the used prices increased as well. So it's not to say like prices didn't come up, because it definitely did. A lot of people are always asking like, have you guys seen prices fall a lot recently? And my answer is not really. We haven't really had to change the price of what we're listing stuff for too much in the last couple of years. I know we definitely saw prices go up between 2020 and 2022. By 2023, I think they kind of flatlined a bit. There's definitely certain more collectible sides of the market, more of the higher end American made stuff that actually still has appreciated in the last year or two. I know we've all seen on the Gibson front that new Gibson prices have been creeping up in the last year or so. And so I have seen the used market reflect that. So even at a time that we're seeing a lot of people say, oh, the guitar market is flooded with used guitars. As far as Gibson stuff goes, I have not seen the prices cool off really at all. And we have a lot in stock. We've sold a lot over the years, but there's a lot of guitars that have come down in price. Like I just mentioned, like the PRS SE. In the last year or two, we started to see way more direct to consumer coming from the big brands. We have seen Fender do certified pre-owned. We've even seen Fender just sell retail from Fender.com, which definitely is not awesome for dealers. We're not an authorized dealer, so it doesn't affect us. I don't have anything to be salty about, but if you are a dealer that has been selling Fender for a long time and paying in 5, if not 6 figures a year into product, I'd probably be a little bummed that I now have to compete with people being able to go to Fender.com. But due to that crazy demand back in 2020 to 2022 for a $500-ish guitar, companies started making a lot more of those, specifically Fender in their Squire line. So they way overproduced guitars probably about 2 years ago at this point. They're getting flooded at these closeout prices, making it really hard for dealers to sell a lot of these Squire guitars at retail price. Now it's tough because if some shop is going to be closing those out at half of retail, 40% off, whatever it is, used guitars can't compete with that. And especially at a guitar that retailed for 400, now it's being sold for 220. And to ship a guitar can cost $60, and then there's fees and everything. the economics start to really not make sense. It's become really tough to be involved in that part of the market. So another common thing that I hear being talked about a lot is that all these people started playing guitar from 2020 to 2022, and maybe they didn't stick with it, and so now the market's getting flooded with these entry to mid-level guitars. There's definitely some truth to that, but to add on to that, you're also seeing a lot of people in a good way that they started back then on their Player Series Tele, and now they're ready to move up to an American Telecaster, or they want a Gibson Les Paul Standard instead of their Epiphone Les Paul. That's cool, that's progress. There's nothing in the world wrong with that. That's not a bad thing about the guitar market. That's kind of always been a thing. I think that's why there's always been this classic thing that like the lower end stuff doesn't hold its price point. When you buy a nice Gibson guitar, it will hold its value. Whereas if you buy an Epiphone, it might be cheaper at the entry point, but it won't hold its value over the years. Now, with all that being said, there's definitely a lot more guitars on the market from the vintage world, from the older used world, and of course the newer used world right now. And so yeah, that definitely has had some impact on prices. The funny thing is like rare stuff is still just as rare. So like harder to find colors and stuff, I haven't seen take too much of a hit. If anything, some of that stuff's actually appreciated a little bit in the last couple of years. The rare stuff seems to be selling through just as good as it ever has, whereas the more basic stuff, the price point hasn't actually cooled off much, but the sell-through definitely wasn't there. Maybe 3 years ago, if we got a Sunburst American Strat, it wouldn't be here more than a week. Whereas the price hasn't come down on those too much, but they're not selling as fast as they were. So we just have to factor in that, hey, it might take a little bit longer for a guitar to find a home since there's just, you know, a little more options out there right now. So I know I'm maybe getting a little bit rambly here, but I do want to draw a few conclusions. This doesn't mean I'm right about any of this. This is just what I see from doing this every day. This is my job. I love what I do. I love watching what's going on in the guitar market. I curate my inventory based off what I'm seeing. My golden rule has always been that I want to curate stuff that I personally really enjoy and that I see value in, because that means that other people probably will as well. On top of that, that needs to be paired with the analytics of, I think that this segment and this price point and all those things are also going to do well. So my kind of predictions for the future is that the higher end-ish stuff, the pro level stuff, are gonna hold their value really well over time. Things are always gonna fluctuate, but I think that there's always gonna be a really strong demand for these instruments made in their country of origin. If it's an American company like Gibson, they're American-made Gibson guitars. If it's a company like Ibanez or ESP, those Japanese-made ESP and Ibanez guitars. So what do I not think is going to do well? For quite a while from now, we're definitely not going to see the price point in the used market strengthening on these intermediate level $300 to $500 guitars. I think if you're a buyer, I think if you're looking to get your first guitar in that price range, this is a great time to be doing it because there's a lot of stuff available. There's a lot of great deals out there. And the guitars being made at that price point right now are really, really great. Even just compared to when I was getting into guitar, which in the grand scheme of things was not like that long ago, damn, nearly 20 years ago. But I think in general, while the dollar amount may change over time, I do think that the ratio of what things cost is going to actually probably stay pretty consistent with what we saw maybe 5, even 10 years ago, as far as an American-made Fender Strat may go for twice as much as the equivalent Mexican-made Strat. And then now that they're introducing other stuff, anything, you know, Indonesian-made or Chinese-made is probably gonna end up a little under that. So as the price point moves up for each series, you'll probably see the older guitars catch up with that and maintain a similar ratio. We're seeing a lot of fluctuation right now. I'm sure we're gonna continue to see that. I'm sure there's gonna be some interesting surprises in both directions of kind of what happens. It's literally impossible to tell. We can all make our predictions. None of us actually know what's gonna happen in the future. The most we can do is look at trends in the past and make predictions based off that. Those are a lot of my thoughts. I hope you guys got some enjoyment out of that. Again, I know some of this might have been a little disjointed. I'm not trying to draw any crazy conclusions or say that I know the future or give you guys any information that I don't truly know. I'd love to read your thoughts as well. So if you have any comments, please leave them down below. We'll get the discussion started. Please keep it respectful between everyone in there. We all love guitars. We all love this stuff. We're all probably in this for similar reasons. So just keep that in mind, even if someone else in the comments has a different opinion than you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, share the video, and all that good stuff. We'll see you again soon. Bye. Stuff isn't being made the way that it was. Some stuff is, and you should pay attention.
Okay. No, it's a good point. It's like, if it's made how the old ones were, then clearly